Good evening. My name is Nancy Malkiel. I'm the Dean of the College and a professor in the Department of History. We are here this evening to talk about The Bell Curve, a book striking, among other things, in the last month or 6 weeks for its ubiquitousness in the popular media. It is difficult to pick up a magazine or to turn on a television program. It's been the cover story in Newsweek and the New York Times Magazine, a whole issue of the New Republic, covered repeatedly in the New York Review of Books, a feature on the Today program, on Larry King Live, on Nightline, and doubtless many other vehicles in the popular media. As of this Sunday, it was number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list, despite its $30 price tag and its 845 pages of graphs, tables, standard deviations, and regression analyses. Now, the hype, if you'll forgive the use of that word, comes in part because of an extremely effective, well-orchestrated publicity campaign on the part of the Free Press and undoubtedly Charles Murray's agent. But it also comes because Herrnstein and Murray are propounding explosive, highly contentious ideas about the relationship between race, class, and intelligence. That intelligence levels differ significantly among ethnic groups, that success or failure in education, economic achievement, and social standing is largely a function of the genes one has inherited, that low intelligence lies at the root of many of our most intractable social problems, that, in their words, the cognitive capital of the country is being eroded by the explosion of births among people with the lowest IQs. And of course, the authors link what they claim to be incontrovertible scientific findings with a number of equally controversial policy prescriptions, that we steer government money away from remedial education to programs for gifted students, that we back off of affirmative action, that we redesign immigration policy to slow the influx of those with substandard IQs. Our panel will have more to say about all of this later on. The point that I would like to establish at the outset, as not as the moderator so much, but as the historian in this group, is that these ideas are not new. Using science, or what passes as science, to establish or certify racial and ethnic hierarchies and to support racially based public policy has a long history, both in the United States and abroad. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was no hotter topic on the scholarly agenda. Biologists, sociologists, anthropologists, and historians embraced the doctrine that the races were discrete biological types distinguished by specific physiological characteristics and ordered hierarchically along an evolutionary scale. Anglo-Saxons or Caucasians stood at the top and blacks at the bottom. These theories at the turn of this century provided important intellectual support for Jim Crow and disfranchisement, the vehicles of the time for the institutionalization of white supremacy. And they combined as well with the eugenics movement of the early 20th century to provide an intellectual justification for the 100% Americanism and immigration restriction of the 1910s and 1920s. Eugenics argued for breeding from the best ethnic types and for restricting the offspring of the worst. It offered dire forebodings of the consequences of the dilution of the American stock through large-scale immigration of supposedly inferior Southern and Eastern Europeans. And as you doubtless know, the supposed science of eugenics was put to other much more sinister ends in Hitler's Germany. Even the specific linking of genes, race, and IQ is not new. The educational psychologist Arthur Jensen and the Nobel Prize-winning physicist William Shockley caused a considerable stir with their highly controversial work along these lines in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Having said all of that, why then do we gather tonight to pay particular attention to the bell curve? This is a book that hits close to home, with its provocative assertions about intelligence, about the limits of education, about how we compose ourselves as an academic community. And we're here tonight to do what a university does best, to subject this book to careful analysis, to mobilize the scholarly expertise and critical judgment of some of the best minds on our faculty, to ask tough questions about Herrnstein and Murray's data and methods, and to test the relationship between their data and their conclusions. And it's to that task that we now turn. We've assembled a panel of scientists and social scientists who are exceedingly well equipped to speak to these issues. And let me just say at the outset, I did not set about to find two who would be pro-Murray and two who would be against, or anything of that sort. Indeed, when I invited the panelists, I did not know what they would think of the book, and I did not know anything about their politics. What I did know was that when I looked in the various disciplines in the sciences and social sciences for those scholars with the particular expertise that could best be brought to bear on the data at hand, these faculty are the ones whom I chose. Now, let me introduce each of our panelists in turn as he or she is ready to speak. Each of them will speak briefly. We hope then to have time to take some questions from the audience. And at the conclusion of the program here this evening, there will be an opportunity in Murray Dodge Hall in a more informal setting for those who wish to continue the conversation to do so. That comes in addition to the special meeting organized after this proceeding is over for resident advisors and minority affairs advisors. Let me begin now with our first speaker, Professor Howard Taylor of the Department of Sociology. Professor Taylor is the former longtime director of the program in Afro-American Studies at Princeton, and he currently directs the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship Program. Professor Taylor has done research in the areas of race relations, social psychology, and the IQ heritability controversy. In the sociology department, he teaches undergraduate courses on the social basis of individual behavior and on sociological research methods. Professor Taylor.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Well, thank you for this invitation. I welcome it. I'm glad to be given the opportunity to talk, as it were, about our work for tonight, The Bell Curve by Herrnstein and Murray. I think the entire argument can be summarized in 5 points. What I'd like to do is mention these 5 points, and then I'm going to talk a bit about calculation of the genetic heritability of IQ and why you really can't do it, and if you do it, even granting all the assumptions that you need to do it, then it comes out to be quite low in contrast to what Herrnstein and Murray argue. But in any case, the 5 points are as follows. First of all, they argue that IQ tests, and to some extent the SAT and the ACT, measure intelligence. I will be quarreling with that, as will some of the rest of us on the panel. That is to say, they're two separate things. Intelligence is one thing and IQ is another. Don't think that they're the same. Intelligence is a construct and IQ is a test, is treated as one way to measure that, and what the connection between the two is called measurement error, and I argue that there's quite a bit of measurement error between intelligence on one hand and IQ test score on the other. The second point is that they make is that intelligence, and thus IQ score, so they argue, is heavily genetically determined. That is to say, heavily determined by genetic makeup. That is to say, it is heavily genetically heritable. The quantity, heritability quantity, they estimate to be high. How they do that and why they can't do it is what I will comment on shortly. Third, they argue that groups differ in IQ. Thus, abstractly, if two groups, A and B, differ in intelligence, they are arguing that because the within-group heritability, genetic heritability of intelligence is high, it therefore seems reasonable to conclude that any between-group difference in IQ score is at least partly genetically heritable. The groups that they define are first SCS groups, socioeconomic status groups. They argue that socioeconomic status groups are determined on a genetic basis, that is to say, people who are, as he calls them, poor white trash, or individuals who are lower class, or individuals who are in the underclass are there because they are genetically doomed to be so. He draws similar reasoning with respect to race differences. He doesn't come around and say it, but he implies it so strongly that he might as well have, that is to say Murray and Herrnstein. And that is that if, once again, there are two groups, in this case whites and blacks, or Hispanics, whites and blacks, or any groups compared that differ in mean IQ score, if it is true that the within-group heritability is high, the within-group genetic heritability is high, it therefore follows necessarily that one can hypothesize that the difference between the groups is heavily genetic. He has very little to say about gender differences. He nonetheless strongly implies that any differences that might exist between men and women, on such as the quantitative part of the SAT, where, as we all know, men tend to do somewhat better on the math sections than women, that this may also have a genetic basis. Now, he doesn't actually come out and say that, but he strongly implies it. Third, there is the famous Herrnstein syllogism. I say Herrnstein syllogism because Murray hadn't much to do with it. Herrnstein published it in 1971, and then again in his book called IQ and the Meritocracy in 1973. And in fact, the book itself, The Bell Curve, is approximately 850 pages of perfectly otherwise good hard copy that says nothing new. They say nothing new beyond Herrnstein's 73 book called IQ and the Meritocracy, which is where Herrnstein stated his syllogism. He did it first in 1971 in an Atlantic Monthly article. It is as follows. First premise, intelligence is largely inherited. That is to say, the effect of genes upon intelligence is a strong causal relationship. Secondly, that intelligence is related to several different kinds of success or measures of success in society, such as high occupation, large amounts of education, high income, and so on and so forth. In other words, high socioeconomic status. The higher one's intelligence, presumably, this causes one to occupy more success in society. That's the second premise. The conclusion would at least logically seem obvious, and that is that the higher intelligence genes that you have, that is to say the better your intelligence genes, then it follows necessarily that genes are at the basis of success. This does not follow. Certainly, the first premise doesn't work, and we'll be discussing different parts of that syllogism as we discuss the book this evening. But then in any case, that's the fourth overall conclusion and point I think that they make. The fifth one is a cluster of recommendations, and I won't say too much about that. Professor Ryan will be, I'm sure. The policy recommendations, which Dean Malkiel has touched upon. He wants to abolish welfare. He wants to abolish minority education. He wants to abolish affirmative action in occupations. He wants to abolish affirmative action in education. These may be criticized in their own right or lack of it, but the point is the entire book is written as though his data, faulty though it is, they are, and his procedures, faulty though they are, it really does not follow, but nonetheless argues that the policy recommendations follow from the presumed science that exists in the book. The book is anything but science. Let me start by talking first, and then I'll be quiet, about the IQ heritability business. And I like shooting my mouth off about this. Let's start there. It seems though that's a good starting point. He argues, as has Shockley, as Nancy Malkiel has pointed out, and Jensen before him, and in fact going all the way back to Sir Francis Galton in 1850, that intelligence is genetically determined. Well, how do they do that? Well, without going into a lot of detail, the basic idea is this. We've all noticed, as have they, and this has not escaped the clever eye of Jensen, Herrnstein, and Murray, that relatives who are genetically similar tend to have a higher similarity in certain traits, such as IQ, than do pairs of relatives that are less genetically similar. For example, monozygotic twins are pairs of twins, clones of each other. Anybody in the audience a monozygotic twin? Raise your hand. It means identical twin. Raise your hand. Do we have any identical twins here? Well, as you can see, it's fairly rare. nonetheless, the study of a certain category of twins, which I'll talk about later, is even rarer, making this data very valuable. There are two kinds of twins to study. One pair are identical twins who were raised together. Now, they noticed that identical twin pairs raised together have extraordinarily high similarity, as judged by a correlation coefficient of 0.9, in a trait such as IQ. They are also similar in all kinds of other things, but the IQ correlation of identical twins raised together is about 0.9 to 0.95, which is extraordinarily high, with one, as you know, being a perfect correlation. Dizygotic twins, or fraternal twins, share about half of their genes on the average in common, and their similarity in IQ is considerably less, about 0.6 or 60%. Siblings, similarly, have half of their genes in common. Brothers, anybody have a brother or sister in the audience? Correlate about 0.5 in their IQ. So there's a slight difference between fraternal twins and siblings, which is presumably due to environment, but it's very slight there. And then cousins. Cousins are similar in their IQ. First cousins are about 25%, or a correlation of about 0.25 similar. So the basic pattern is what? The basic pattern seems fairly apparent. That is to say, the closer a pair is in biological relatedness or genetic overlap with identical twins, since they are clones of each other being the maximal, the more similar they are in certain traits such as IQ. This leads many, such as Jensen and Herrnstein and Murray, to conclude that genes must therefore be at the basis of IQ. Well, there's a problem with this technique, which you've seen. The problem is that with, say, identical twins raised together, they're very similar. They're identical genetically, but the problem is they're also very similar in their environment. They were raised in the same family, went to the same schools, had the same kind of education, same kind of home training, same nutrition, and a whole bunch of other things that are the same. We call these environmental similarities. Therefore, their genetic similarity is confounded with their environmental similarity. The question then is how to separate the two. It has not escaped the interest of Herrnstein and Murray that one way to do that would be to imagine oneself doing a natural experiment. That is to take identical twins, and if you could do so, randomly allocate them to separate environments, completely at random, and a wide range of environments. That is to say, study separated twins, twins who have been separated, identical twins, who have been separated early in life and raised in separate environments. Now, whereas this is impossible to attain in the ideal, there are studies, there are 4 to be exact, now 5 studies actually, of the very, very small number of twin pairs in the world, worldwide, who have been raised separately. It's a very small sample. But in any case, they studied them, and the most recent study is by a team led by Thomas Bouchard at University of Minnesota, who was a psychologist, and studies that have been cited by Jensen and others who claim to find that the IQ similarity, or the correlation in the IQ of separated twins, or twins who are presumed to be separated, is 0.8, or 80%. Well, that would be pretty convincing evidence. You know, when I first saw that, I said, that's pretty convincing. The problem is when you look at the fine print. Guess what the fine print shows? Some of these twins who were presumed to have been raised separately were not raised separately at all. They were raised next door to each other, going to the same school, having the same teachers. One was raised by the mother, the other by the mother's sister, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, you know, Aunt Jane. And, you know, these twins are being presented in the literature as though we were raised separately. So what some of us did, and I've looked at some of this data quite carefully, is that if you split the twins up into different degrees of separateness of the pairs, we find that if you look at those who were not really quite so separate, yeah, the correlation comes out to 0.75 or 0.8, 75, 80%. But if you look at the subsample of twins that are fairly separate, guess what you find? That similarity between their IQs goes down to 0.45. And then, if you look at the really quite separate, which is the way you're supposed to do it, that quantity is a truer estimate given all the assumptions, even assuming that IQ measures intelligence, which it really does not. But let's assume for the sake of argument that it does. Even then, twins that are quite separate only show a 0.25. 0.25 correlation now, degree of similarity in their IQs, leaving 75 to 80% to environment. It completely reverses the conclusions of Herrnstein and Murray. But they choose to ignore this data. They choose to ignore these data, I should say. They choose to ignore the analyses that show that, and so on and so forth. The conclusion there, even if you accept all of the assumptions and grant the assumptions, which I am not willing to grant, the conclusion is that the genetic heritability of IQ is about 25%, leaving 75% to environment gene-environment interaction, and a whole lot of other fancy quantitative quantities that we'll bore you with later. The point is, it's 25% genetic, and that's it. Now, it could be a little lower than that, could be a little higher, and it's not really a calculable quantity anyway, because there's so many assumptions and variables and quantities that you have to know about, and I'm sure Professor Tilghman will talk about that. But if you just look at this little simple quantity of what is the correlation between the really separated twins, it's very, very low. I'm about to be quiet now, but I'll mention also that if you do some analyses that are a little fancier using systems of simultaneous equations to solve for the heritability quantity across different relatives, and if you meet some of these assumptions and you vary the assumption that is for the environmental similarity quantity, that even then the heritability quantity, which you now solve for as a value in a set of equations, comes out to about 0.25 to 0.35. It seems to me then, as far as I can see, even granting some of the assumptions that the IQ heritability, and that's not intelligence heritability, this is the heritability of IQ score, is very low. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Professor Deborah Prentice of the Department of Psychology, is a social psychologist whose work investigates the influence of societal factors on the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals. She has an interest as well in methodological and statistical issues that arise in the interpretation of psychological data. She has taught Psychology 101 alone and with colleagues, as well as graduate statistics in the Department of Psychology. For the past year and a half, she has been a preceptor in the University Center for Human Values and has taught or will teach with their sponsorship a freshman seminar on groups, norms, and values, as well as a course on the psychology of moral behavior. Professor Prentice.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to focus my comments today on the question of what we learn about IQ from this book. Okay? Simply, what do the data that Herrnstein and Murray present have to tell us about IQ? What I want to try to do is to separate the science from the politics of this book and to ask what the science has to tell us. Let me begin by saying a few words about what IQ is and what IQ is not. Some of this will overlap with what Howard said. What IQ is an individual difference test. It has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. IQ scores are defined in a relative way. That is, the numbers don't have any inherent meaning. They tell you where you are in the distribution of IQ scores relative to other people of your age. It's easy to forget that and to start thinking about these scores as having some sort of absolute meaning in themselves. What IQ is not, first, IQ is not a pure measure of cognitive ability, as Howard said. Herrnstein and Murray tend to equate an IQ score with a person's inherent level of intelligence, in part by calling IQ throughout the book cognitive ability. It's not a pure measure of ability. It's a psychological test, or really it's any number of psychological tests. And like all tests, performance on them depends on some combination of motivation and ability. Second, IQ is neither a good nor a bad dimension on which to evaluate people. It doesn't have any inherent value. In fact, some people have worried about institutions or societies in which IQ is a strong predictor of success. As Herrnstein and Murray note, in 1960, the Harvard faculty decided not to admit students purely on the basis of academic potential as measured by tests, but to consider a broader range of human qualities. The dean at Harvard explained why, voicing his fears that Harvard would, and I quote, become such an intellectual hothouse that the unfortunate aspects of a self-conscious intellectualism would become dominant, and the precious, the brittle, and the neurotic would take over. Now, we don't worry about this happening as much as we used to, but I use this example to illustrate the point that there's nothing inherently special or good about IQ. Third, IQ is not fixed and immutable. There are plenty of studies that demonstrate IQ gains associated with an improvement in environmental conditions. Studies have shown, for example, that when standards of living in a community improve, the IQs of the residents improve. When children live in impoverished environments, there's a substantial correlation between the length of time they've spent in the environment and their IQ. Children who are adopted into high IQ households end up having higher IQs. Now, to be fair, Herrnstein and Murray know these studies. What they want to claim is that we might as well treat IQ as fixed and immutable because it's very hard to intentionally create the conditions that will change it. That's a statement about their beliefs about intervention possibilities, not about the nature of IQ. A number of panelists are talking about heritability, so I will not, but it's important to remember that IQ can be changed. So what do we learn about IQ from Herrnstein and Murray? Well, probably the most persuasive data concern the correlations between IQ and various measures of success. So to give you a sense of what they find, IQ is increasingly important in college selections, in who gets degrees and in where they go. IQ is increasingly important in job selections, that is, in who ends up in which occupation. IQ predicts job productivity. Increasingly, IQ predicts salary. So basically, people with high IQs are more likely to go to college and get graduate degrees, more likely to go into professional and managerial occupations, where they will be more productive and will earn more money. Okay? That's what high IQ gets you. The flip side of these positive outcomes is that IQ's correlation with social problems is considerable as well, although not nearly as high. IQ predicts the likelihood of dropping out of high school. It predicts the likelihood of living in poverty and of ending up in a correctional facility. It predicts the likelihood of having a first baby out of wedlock, the likelihood of that baby being low birth weight, and that child's scores on developmental tests in infancy. And to a negligible extent, it predicts unemployment and divorce. In most of these cases, the correlations with IQ are not very strong, and that's an important thing to remember, with the exception of educational outcomes. And here, that makes sense. That's what IQ tests were developed for. They were to look at the potential for educational success. But there does seem in these cases to be a link of some sort between IQ and social problems. Now, I want to make several points about these findings. The first is that they're not independent findings, obviously. The general message is that IQ predicts, to a considerable degree, educational and economic success. These are not, it doesn't predict each of these things independently, even though they're presented as independent, and in fact, in independent chapters in the text, in the book. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. But what are we to make of these correlations? Well, here you could have 100 equally valid explanations. The data are very, very indeterminate. Herrnstein and Murray have their story for what to make of these correlations. Their explanation is very simple. IQ is the direct cause of these differences in educational and economic attainment, and IQ is the cause of social problems. It is the inability of people with low IQ to reason well that leads them to make bad decisions about having a baby or committing a crime, and then to be mired in the consequences of those decisions. Admittedly, only occasionally do they actually articulate this argument, but when they do, this is the form that their argument takes. Do the data substantiate their story? Well, they're certainly consistent with their story, but they're consistent with many, many other stories as well. If you assume, as Herrnstein and Murray do, that IQ is largely inherited and is fixed at birth, then it may make sense to say that IQ is a direct cause of all of these educational and economic triumphs and tragedies, but the data don't say that. The data don't even say that IQ is the causal factor. One common alternative argument, for example, is that social and economic advantage are responsible, that social and economic advantage cause both IQ scores and poverty, crime, and all the rest of it. Herrnstein and Murray try to refute this argument by controlling for socioeconomic status in their analyses, but this is by no means a perfect solution. So the point is that the data themselves do not imply the explanation for them. Okay? All they say is that there's some kind of a relationship between IQ and success. What else might be going on? Well, let me give you an alternative social psychological interpretation of these data. And let me, just to illustrate the range of possibilities, start with the assumption that the direction of causality goes from IQ to social outcomes. Okay? That's by no means true necessarily, or certainly not strictly true, but at least it's a place to start. So how then might IQ have educational and economic consequences? Let me try to appeal to your intuitions. Most of you have probably spent your whole lives thinking of school as a success domain. You always did better than most of your classmates in school. When it came time to take standardized tests, you could count on doing well. When you were a little kid in elementary school, you probably brought home many scores above the 90th percentile to show your parents. For most of you, it was probably never a question of whether you had the ability to go to college. It was only a question of where and perhaps when you would go. Things like school and SATs weren't hurdles on the road to success, they were stepping stones. You probably thought of yourself as someone who was good at school. In other words, most of you probably had ample reason to believe that you were